start. Welcome to the Battle of Ideas. My name is Ella Whelan. I was the assistant editor at Spike Time, now a freelance journalist, and I'm working today with the Academy of Ideas. Delighted to have been asked to host this strand, Identity Wars, Feminism Post-Me Too. And we're starting with what is the point of feminism, the F word, as I've called it. Just to tell you a little bit more about why we've decided to do this, certainly Me Too has catapulted feminism into public discussion. I think it'd be very hard pushed to find anyone who hasn't had some kind of conversation about Me Too or feminism or what it means to be a woman or any of those things over the past few months. And today what we want to do in true Battle of Ideas style is dig down into the issues, see what's really going on, and really honour the slogan of the festival, Free Speech Allowed. So as this is a public debate, an open debate, we want to hear your voices and your opinions as well as the speakers. How this is going to run, just before I introduce the speakers, is that we'll have a few introductory speeches, might have a few questions, and then we will go straight out to the audience. So first, you will note that I am a speaker down. Sophie Walker from the Women's Equality Party sends her apologies. She has a flu. Her and the Women's Equality Party told me at 6 o'clock last night that she couldn't be here, so unfortunately they were unable to send a representative. However, I'm going to not try and put words in Sophie's mouth, but hopefully bring a little bit of their point of view to the debate, question the other speakers on it. That doesn't matter necessarily because we still have three fantastic speakers. First of all, we have Izzy Lyons, who is a journalist at The Telegraph and writes on lots of issues in relation to feminism and free speech. Next up, we have Laura Coryton, who is the campaigner of End Tampon Tax campaign. You will have seen her on the news writing about this issue. She's, over the past few years, been very outspoken in relation to feminism. And last but not least, we have Dr. Jan Macvarish, who is a visiting research fellow at the Centre for Parenting Culture Studies at the University of Kent and writes frequently on feminism as well. So, without further ado, I'd like to ask Izzy to kick us off.
Thank you, Ella, and thank you very much for having me. My name is Izzy. I'm 24 years old, and I do not consider myself a feminist. It's a statement that not many people would expect to come out of a millennial's mouth, especially one who is a woman. It's also a statement that 5 or 6 years ago I probably wouldn't have said at all. As a young, inquisitive teenager, I was in awe of feminists. In fact, it was the unapologetically outspoken, fearless, and ballsy feminist fighters of the 20th century that I owe much of my interest today in politics and social issues. Women like the Irish revolutionary Constance Markievicz, whose formidable responses to sexist men in the early 20th century Ireland make for encouraging reading in today's rather vapid Me Too culture. Women like Anne Robinson, whose recent piece of advice to young women that they should laugh off unwanted advances from men rather than crying in the loos, in my opinion, is the most sensible piece of advice dished out so far in 2018. Anne Leslie, who told women to grow a backbone, is a close first-place contender. With their fiery words of wit and unwavering refusal to adopt a shred of victimhood that for so many centuries men insisted defined us, it's these older feminists that never fail to remind me just how capable women are and always were. So I absolutely do not think they should sit back, close their mouths, and leave it to the youngsters. In fact, I don't think their voices are loud enough. Over the past several years, the cries of oppression within contemporary feminism have not only become more and more ridiculous, and as a young woman, more and more alienating, but they have ultimately resulted in a movement that seeks to dictate women's lives rather than liberate them. From the feminist campaign to end page 3 in tabloid newspapers in 2015, to the more recent ban on grid girls from Formula One courses in the wake of Me Too, contemporary feminism has become obsessed with telling women what they can and can't do. In both of the instances I just mentioned, women have been stopped from doing jobs that they have chosen and want to do, all because another woman has decided that it isn't in their best interest. They have decided that these women are victims of the male gaze, rather than independent adults undeterred by the rather innocuous act of a man staring at them. That they are victims of the patriarchy, rather than grown women with agency over their own bodies. I would quite like to live in a society where the latter is widely accepted, where we trust women, trust them to make their own decisions, to choose how they earn a living, what they eat, wear, and drink, trust them to vote for whoever they wish without sneering assumptions of their internal oppression, and trust that they are not wallflowers ready to wilt at the first sign of a Beachbody-ready advert. However, today we seem to be settling for a feminist movement that does the exact opposite, one that seems far less interested in demanding the right for women to live how they respectively wish, but rather that they cover up and put some clothes on, get a more respectable job, and stop propping up the patriarchy by their decision to wear skimpy outfits. This is what I believe has ultimately caused the generational divide in feminism today, a very distinct shift in the tone adopted by those at the forefront of the movement. It's no longer an army of arduous women fueled by the belief that women should have complete control over their life choices, but one that believes we need more protection, more of a leg up, more help from the state, and more guidance over whether we should or shouldn't watch Love Island. The modern movement has become so insistent on what a woman is and should be that I honestly believe many within it don't realise that they sound as possessive, controlling, and bossy as the suited blokes in top hats that would determine how women should live some 100 years ago. So, the point in feminism today, I sadly don't really believe that there is one. Under its current leadership, the Feminism Party seems hell-bent on ignoring what women actually want for a rosy, one-dimensional idea of what they think women should be. Only 1 in every 3 of us in the UK considers ourselves a feminist, a figure I'm not remotely surprised at. In the same poll, only 42% of women said they were a feminist. For all the reasons I've just outlined, I think this number is only ever going to dwindle. There will be more young, inquisitive women who are inherently interested in their right to freedom of choice that will become disillusioned with a movement that seems so intent on obsessing over irrelevant individual choices, pressure that their brothers, boyfriends, and male best friends will never have to face. I relish every rare consensus-breaking opinion that a feminist from waves gone by manages to get out into the mainstream. I honestly believe that they represent far more women than we give them credit for. I feel I should lastly note too that I'm well aware there are a host of attitudes and obstacles facing women today that still need to be tackled, and the old school feminist in me is ready and raring to go. From affordable childcare to fighting for free legal abortions for all women in the UK, not just those of us that are lucky enough to live in England. There is still a lot of work to be done. But should these arguments and this demand for change be in the hands of a youth-fueled movement that thinks we can't handle bikini adverts, unwanted flirty advances from men, and Love Island? In my opinion, absolutely not.
Thank you, Izzy. Laura.
Thank you. So hi everyone, my name is Laura and thank you for having me as well. So just a little bit of background first of all. So I started the End Tampon Tax campaign, which is led by a petition signed by 320,000 men and women alike. It has successfully pushed legislation through both the EU Parliament and the UK Parliament to end the 5% tax rate that we pay on period products. And I also hope that it's helped to empower every single person who's clicked sign on the petition as well. I've also just finished writing my first book called Speak Up, and it's a campaigning guide for rebel gals, which will be launched for International Women's Day next year, and I really hope that it will help to equip girls to take on the world of politics. But perhaps most importantly, I consider myself to be a feminist. So through this talk, I want to talk about 2 main things. Firstly, I want to give a very brief definition of what it means to be a feminist for me. And secondly, I want to talk about the generational divides within the movement, if there are any, indeed. So first of all, a quick definition. So for me, feminism is about solving problems. It's about ensuring that the next generation face fewer obstacles than we face today. To achieve this, feminism allows a concoction of disenfranchised groups to speak up. It provides a new platform upon which the traditionally marginalised can be heard, can make changes, and can solve the problems that they face. Now, you're probably wondering why I haven't mentioned the word woman yet. Well, I haven't mentioned this word yet because I wanted to do so really thoughtfully. The truth is that although feminism is of course about solving problems that women, the second sex, face, feminism is becoming increasingly about solving the different problems that different women face. What I'm trying to say is that feminism is about solving the problems that constitute sexism. Of course, obviously it is. But feminism is also about solving the problems that constitute a whole heap of other isms. These isms hold back women and make sure that people's voices aren't necessarily heard as loud as they should be. It's about intersections of feminism and racism, classism, anti-Semitism, ableism, the list goes on. Feminism is complicated, and the category of woman is endlessly multifaceted. But that's what makes feminism so interesting, and it's what keeps this F word relevant today. It's why we need feminism now. So long as we face problems that need to be solved, voices that need to be amplified and seek platforms upon which to make changes, we need this F word and we need feminism. Okay, so now just to talk really briefly about the generational divides within the feminist movement. So many generations have called themselves feminists, but not all feminists are the same. We hold different opinions, we have different views on things, and each generation puts their new stamp on the movement. So why and how are there clear generational divides within the feminist movement? Well, in my opinion, the answer to this springs from the idea of solving problems. As each generation faces different problems, so too will each feminists and each generation of feminists need to solve these different problems in different ways. For example, feminists lobbied Cambridge University, one of the most leading universities in the world, as well as many other institutions, to accept women onto their degree courses for decades. And their campaign tactics ranged from the spread of literature to demonstrations, motions within the university, and even planned acts of violence as well. But it wasn't until 1947 that the first female student was accepted at Cambridge University. This means that for little over 70 years, women have had the choice to go to Cambridge, and they've been considered capable of a higher education at this leading institution. Men, on the other hand, have been accepted to Cambridge for over 800 years. Today, we face different problems, from the mass sexual harassment of women to the fact that only 9% of UN member countries have a female head of government. Feminism isn't just about bikini bodies, it's also about these more institutionalized problems that women face today and hold them back. But what's exciting is not necessarily that we face a whole heap of new problems, it's that we're solving them in brand new ways. We have a new superpower that feminists simply couldn't access some 50 years ago. Today, we're solving these problems that we face by utilizing the internet, and we're winning as well. Although the majority of Change.org petitions, for example, and by the way, Change.org is one of the biggest petition sites online, the majority of their petitions are started by men, but the majority of successful petitions that achieve their goals are started, run, and supported by women. This is exciting because it gives us a brand new political sphere that we haven't necessarily had before, and it gives women a new platform upon which to really win campaigns. These online campaigns have solved so many problems, from ending page 3 to axing tampon tax to showcasing the extent to which sexual harassment thrives through the Me Too movement. This jump to online feminism is really exciting because it involves everyone. It involves me, everybody on this panel, everyone sitting in this room, and that includes each and every one of you. The true power of the internet to create change, empower disenfranchised groups, and solve all of the many isms that plague us today and hold us back is entirely unknown. It's up to us to push the boundaries, to make changes and to speak up. There's power in your voice and there is possibility in the internet. And in combining the two, anyone can make any change they really want to see. And that includes women and all of the disenfranchised groups that have traditionally been excluded from politics. And that, for me, is what feminism is today. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Jan.
Thanks, Ella. So I've been trying to think over the last few weeks what to call this new feminism without calling it feminism. Because as soon as you start criticising the contemporary form of feminism, you have to then draw all these lines and distinctions between, well, I don't mean that feminism or that feminist. Yes, there's some high points in feminist history, perhaps. There's some good points of solidarity. And it becomes very, very messy very quickly. And the claim is made, as Laura just did, that feminism is diverse. But maybe in your contributions, you could offer me some suggested words that could substitute the new feminism as a term to try to capture what it is that I'm describing, if you think that what I'm describing has got some truth to it. So because what often calls itself feminism today, I would not associate with much of the feminist political activism which has achieved genuine gains for humanity, or the kind of feminist scholarship which I work with quite a lot, which has provided genuine insights into previously unexplored dimensions of human experience. I think that the phenomenon I'm concerned about today, which does get called and calls itself feminism, is probably best described as a worldview. By that I mean that it's a framework for thinking that promises to make our very big world, with very diverse people in it, a little bit smaller and more manageable. A worldview can be quite expansive, like a full-blown religion, or it can be little more than a set of prejudices formed into a narrative, like a conspiracy theory. But either way, if it's a closed worldview, its primary purpose is to reproduce itself in order that it can do the job of reassuring us as individuals who embrace it that we now know how the world works and what our place is within it. Teaching at a university, I noticed a few years ago that more and more undergraduate students, not just women, but primarily young women, offered up the patriarchy as the explanation for many social phenomena. It didn't really matter what we were talking about. Where once students would have offered up the media, students started to offer up the patriarchy as the explanation, which I thought was quite peculiar because they didn't look to me like the kind of people that were scholars of feminism. They weren't really very scholarly necessarily, as a lot of undergraduates aren't. But nevertheless, this was the term that they used to explain the world. And as though this was ended the need for any further intellectual exploration. And it made me really wonder why it was that this explanation or this cause appealed to young women just as they were heading out into the world. And it made me think that the particular way in which contemporary feminism as a worldview provides a sense of certainty is by continually reinventing the bright lines of an eternal sex war. Patriarchy is offered up as a mystical force, a fundamental circular dynamic by which men lord it over women just because they are men, or are men infected by toxic masculinity. There's really no rational explanation offered for the arrangements which still seem to be unfair between the sexes. Even if they claim to be structural explanations, there's never really an attempt to explain why. And I've asked many contemporary feminists this, but why? Why? Why do you think things are this way? And what is it that patriarchy gains from this? And the answer is always ultimately men. And so women are continually invited to offer up examples of bad male behaviour in order that the eternal truth of a male-female split as fundamental is affirmed. The penance for these male sins and the redemption for the women who share them is to be found in deep-reaching rules of engagement to police the battle lines between the sexes. Hence the calls for consent training, behaviour codes, or actual laws to police the battle lines between males and females. In the process, freedom is sacrificed for an illusory security. This new feminism, which I asked a French friend of mine yesterday who can't quite believe what feminism is in this country at the moment, what she would call it, and she just said protectionism. I think maybe fear feminism is how I would coin it, but I'm open to suggestions. I don't agree with Laura that this is essentially a problem-solving phenomenon. It's a problem-mongering phenomenon. As such, the contemporary feminist entrepreneurs are reacting against freedom, not seeking its extension. And in some ways, I think this is understandable. We look around this room today, and it's a really pretty even split between men and women. Women's emergence from the protected space in which they once lived into the unchaperoned public world of bars, streets, offices, conferences has inevitably exposed more of us to ungentlemanly behaviour. We are no longer confined to the snug bar of the Rover's Return, for those of you who are over the age of 40. Middle-class women now work in mixed workplaces alongside men in ways that working-class women have done for much longer. They're unconfined to the female-only typing pool. In the past, respectable women confined themselves to respectable, protected spaces. But women who are equal, who are free, can choose not to do this. The freedom to take risks and to expose ourselves to the uncertainties of the big wide world was fundamental to women's liberation from the narrower world of the parlour and the kitchen. I don't think this type of attempt to manage uncertainty is unique to feminism. It's a general phenomenon of our times, which is again why I think we need an alternative word for it. If you look at the online propagandizing of people like Tommy Robinson, they have a similar end of days, everything's getting worse, under siege mentality, and a similar obsession with sex. Except the problem for them, for the anti-Muslim propagandists, is not men, but Muslim men. They gather and circulate photographs, stories and videos of bad Muslim behaviour from all over the world and use these to make the argument that Muslims are the major threat that we face. It's actually the same way as stories of manspreading, mansplaining, everyday sexism collates examples of bad behaviour in order to reinforce the idea that this worldview that is proffered by contemporary feminism is the true one. What these worldviews share is a tendency to catastrophise, a tendency to continually inflate risks and to draw continuums between mild incivilities, somebody sitting with their legs apart, and dreadful violent acts. In some ways, in these fearful, apparently out-of-control times, these worldviews seem preferable to a one-against-all worldview of totally alienated individuals battling one against all. At least we have our tribe, our allies. But the price of creating the tribe of women, in the way it is currently being done, is to persuade girls and young women in particular that they enter the world not only at a disadvantage, but fundamentally under threat. And this is a very dismal worldview, which in some ways I can't square with the quite pretty, jolly, we're a queen, I'm a diva, we're all empowered rhetoric that often accompanies it. But I'm not sure that that worldview actually works for adults who are actually dealing with the normal complexities of real life, with family life, with having an intimate partner, with walking down the street just because you have to, with wanting to socialise, feeling free to go out and about, and dealing with the workplace as it actually is. I think there's a profound gulf between the loud voices, as Izzy referred to, declaiming all men and boys as potentially toxic threats, and the much quieter voices who assume that their fathers, brothers, husbands and mates would be equally horrified as they are by another man's bad behaviour. We realise that most men are our indivisible allies in the upholding of reasonable, civilised social norms, not complicit with their transgressors. I worry that there's a real risk that the perpetual insulting of men and boys will wear down their sense of solidarity with us. And unfortunately, I think the quiet voices of the women who maybe haven't quite realised how forceful this new voice is and exactly how institutionalised it is, it doesn't need any further amplification as far as I'm concerned. It's in the schools, it's in the universities, it's in the police, it's everywhere, it's in the law. The quiet voices are quiet partly because they realise they will often get shouted down by the women who claim to speak for them. And just to end on an example, I took part in a debate in Sweden last year at the height of Me Too and was challenging the Me Too movement's willingness to overturn justice and freedom in the name of sharing stories, unfounded allegations about men. And I was called a witch. And one of the panellists, who was the leading proponent of Me Too in Sweden, said, I'm a witch, you're a witch, I'm on a witch hunt and we will hunt you down. Now, that's that doesn't sound like there's a whole lot of solidarity going on there. So I would put it out to the room, really. What can we call this new phenomenon that has so little in common with some of the more positive aspects of feminism in the past?
Thank you, Jan. Just before we go out, I've just got a few questions for the panelists, because I think there's been some interesting divisions brought up. Laura, let's start with you, because Jan has posed it to you that rather than being problem-solving, feminism today is problem-mongering. And certainly I'm thinking of, as an example, I don't know if anyone saw recent news that there are lots of millennials, with certainly young women, who are saying that they are scared of sex, not wanting to have sex, not wanting to be promiscuous, which, like at Olympia, I assume has something potentially to do with Me Too and the sexual harassment, the news of sexual harassment and the prevalence of it. Answer that. What do you think about that?
So first of all, quickly with the sex ed question, and then I'll go on to the idea of not problem solving So generally, I think that sex education is rubbish in schools. And I think that that really doesn't help in making both men and women feel comfortable, not only in sexual situations, but in their bodies as well. And I think that's why we end up with things like tampon tax and girls feeling like they can't talk about their periods. And we have things like period poverty, where girls miss school now because they don't have access to period products because they can't talk about their own bodies. So I think that maybe better sexual education would help in that. And also lots of feminist debates about consent. They really are trying to help women and men also feel comfortable and confident in knowing that they have a right to stop things or start things when, if they want to. And it's okay if they don't want to do something, that's fine. So really quickly going back to the, I found like it was quite interesting that Jan talked about sort of the idea of Islamophobia in a way, and talking about the dangers of exaggerating the negative qualities of a group. And I kind of think that's what a lot of anti-feminists tend to do about feminism. Like, yes, you do have extreme feminists, but they don't speak on behalf of the feminist movement. So many feminists, and the majority of them, have friends that are guys, and we do like guys as well. And guys are really important in the feminist movement. Just take, for example, Emma Watson's He for She United Nations campaign. It just highlights the fact that the feminist movement at its core really does appreciate the alliances of men as well.
Okay, thanks. Izzy, you made a distinction between what's going on today and you're not liking that, and then they kind of brought up some figures from the past or ideas from the past that might serve some of the issues today. I mean, the fact is that lots of young women, certainly that I talk to, say we still face injustice. I still get wolf whistled at. I still have a hard time at work. Life still isn't great for me, and I face issues that the guy in my class doesn't face. Why is it, do you think that feminism today is sort of forgetting about that, or is it just a sort of tactical thing that they're going about it the wrong way?
I think it is tactical, and I do think it's gone about the wrong way. A lot of the stuff that you were referencing just then, so a lot of my friends say that we still face injustices. It's absolutely nowhere near as bad as what our mothers and grandmothers faced. Like, that was institutionalized sexism. And a lot of what we face today, I think, is part of this victimhood culture. Yes, I get wolf whistled on the street. Yes, I get sent gross messages by creeps on social media. But does that mean I'm a victim? No. Does that mean I need more protection from the state? No. Because if it happens to a bloke, if it happens to my brother, he'd laugh it off and get over it. But if it's women, apparently we're incapable of tackling that. And one thing I would say, Laura, you sort of, my issue with feminism was summed up perfectly in sort of five seconds of your speech, where you said your definition of it is giving women more choice. And I just couldn't disagree with that more, because then you went on to say, when we got rid of page 3, and I would be absolutely fascinated to know how you think that constitutes choice for women when a feminist campaign ended an industry where women, that is what they choose to do. It's a contradiction. It doesn't give women more choice. In fact, the evidence you cited did the opposite.
Okay, thank you. Jan, I'm fascinated by this idea that it might be just the way that we might need a relabeling, because a lot of the time when I get asked about feminism, people say, is it just the word? That's why I called it the F word. Is it just this sort of, is it now sort of used as an insult almost, like people just get turned off by the word feminism? Or do you think actually that feminist campaigns of the past or feminist theories of the past have something to answer for? Because surely it isn't just that there's lots of, silly feminists out there who are going on about all these silly campaigns and they're getting it wrong, but actually that this has been a line of thought, especially victimhood in women, the anti-men sort of angle. Hasn't that been there sort of for decades?
Well, I think every idea is there within feminism, because feminism, I mean, it's logical, isn't it? Because if feminism is sort of reflective of women, as in half the world, you're going to have pretty much everything within it. And at different points in history, the loudest voices in feminism represent really quite different ideas. So in the early 20th century, it was particularly focused on birth control, for example, a particular problem of the time. But wrapped up in that, if you look at Mary Stopes, for example, who I'm sure people study at school to some extent, really great strides were made in opening up the discussion about sex and in genuinely providing contraceptive services and advice to women. At the same time, there's some really, really regressive ideas in Mary Stopes. She had simply elitist ideas about who should be allowed to breed, which is partly why she thought contraception should be promoted. You have to weave your way through the good and the bad in the history of feminism. So in some ways, yes, I don't think I had to simplify things a bit in the way I introduced things, as in that past feminism, okay, present feminism, good. No, you have to weave your way through the good and the bad. But I think there is definitely some good in there. And some of the best aspects of feminism, I think genuinely were offering... it was offering solidarity to women who really did need some actual support in the real world. Feminists did set up women's refuges. That was actually really quite an important thing to do. And they still do run them. And it's not feminists who sit on panels, it's feminists who would not be in this room because they're actually running women's refuges. And they're not the pretty online feminists. They are a very different breed. Now, the problem is that those feminists, I think, have been far too quiet and uncritical of the young feminists who have taken one aspect of female experience and one aspect of feminism, and that's the thing they've run with. And for all the reasons I say about what I think generally culturally is amplified and encouraged.
Brilliant. Okay, let's hear from you. Just as an embarrassing start poll, put your hand up if you do call yourself a feminist today and you're happy with that title. Okay, there's a lot of hands up. There's a lot of hands up in the room. Okay, put your hands up if you think that you're not completely happy with feminism at the moment. You think there's some issues, you perhaps disagree with me too, there's something you want to talk about. Good, so you're going to have a lot of opinions. Right.
Laura, I did relate more to what you were saying. But what I thought was interesting is that not one of you mentioned, that I heard anyway, anything relevant to any other country. So feminism is not about young millennial white women banging their fists on the table saying it's not fair. That's not what it's about. That's never what it's been about. There's girls in other countries who are they're having genital mutilation. They're being married off at 12 years old. And I know that's not a problem which is specific to women. It's not just women, but feminism is about every problem being faced all over the world, not just by women, but everyone, and it's tackling it head on.
Thank you very much.
Izzy, you talked about women's freedom to do what they like with their bodies, and page 3, etc. What do you feel about what I regard as a problematic area, prostitution, women in pornography? Because you could say that there's an element of manipulation and promoting images of women which may not be very healthy for women of my daughter's age.
Mm-hmm. So as someone mentioned before, I do agree with a lot of what all of you are saying. And I just wanted to ask whether you think that the subcategories of feminism, such as liberal feminism, radical feminism, as well as radical feminism and their subcategories within that, so like sex worker exclusionary radical feminism, trans exclusionary radical feminism, white feminism, cause people to have a muddy or confused opinion of feminism? Do you think that's why so many people now wouldn't consider themselves a feminist because of these opinions that they've been given by people who have completely different ideas of feminism?
Mike Buchanan of the political party Justice for Men and Boys. It's a question to all four of you, actually. In our last election manifesto, we explored 20 areas where the human rights of men and boys in Britain today are assaulted by the state, almost always to privilege women and girls. And I'd like to know if there are any areas that you know of where the state assaults the human rights, pardon me, I'm not well, assaults the human rights of women and girls.
Hi, I'm going to sit down because I'm holding a baby.
That's okay.
You guys have demonstrated that women are capable of getting the state and men to do as they wish, whether it's to protect women or to give them more freedom. Either way, we have immense power over men, and that is my observation as an anti-feminist. My question to you is, perhaps we should stop talking about feminism, trying to redefine it, trying to see if there are any more issues, because we've demonstrated that we can get what we want if we want to, and we could start talking about the lives of men and boys and how they are being sent to a 70% suicide rate compared to women, and all the issues that Mike Buchanan next to me will highlight in his 20 points of human rights against men and boys. I am very much part of the online world of anti-feminism, and I talk to lots of men all the time who come to us because they are completely distraught, depressed and angry, and they're joining something called MGTOW. Lots of you might know what that is. They try to be MRAs and they see that it doesn't work because the only people who have the real political power are women via men or by themselves. So can you respond to my comments about the increasing anger and depression that I'm seeing from men?
I think it's sometimes forgotten how the woman's question was actually won over quite early. From 1970s, 1980s, I think most men who were political were completely on side of women's rights. And I think what's different now is with the Me Too campaign and the new form of feminism, which is probably closer to gender identity politics and actual feminism, is that it doesn't kind of bring men on side in the way that the form of feminism, suffragettes or feminism in the 1980s, it really appealed to people who were political. And I think what this kind of suggests is just how depoliticised this form of feminism has become. It's very exclusionary in terms of its central point about being about identity and being a victim of male behaviour. So I'm interested on the panellists' comments on this, how the woman's question was resolved, I think, in terms of the argument a long, long time ago, and men were definitely on side with that. The situation that we've got today, the interesting observation is how men are not encouraged to be on side with this, but just constantly seen as the source of all women's problems.
Thank you very much. Okay, we're going to come back to the panel. Now, you will not be able to answer every single question. You're going to have 2 minutes. Pick up on your most favourite question, even just make a point. Right, Laura, let's start with you.
Okay, so first, really quickly to the first question, just about women across the world, and I think that is a really important point, and that feminism in England can support feminism anywhere across the world, and it's about women supporting women and feminism supporting feminism, so that's a really good point. The rest of it was sort of about, I'm going to try and combine the last 3 questions, sort of. Mm-hmm. So basically about trying to make it more male-friendly. Basically, I think there shouldn't be seen to be a competition between, how much does the state or laws, negatively affect women versus men. Everyone's trying to improve policies and people's lives and people's experiences, and we can support each other in that. Lots of men get involved with the feminist movement, and they are really important. But feminism isn't about really victimhood or being anti-men. It's about challenging the institutions that affect the way that people are heard and affect the jobs that women can get, the jobs that job opportunities that people have. So I think men and women both together can challenge institutional problems, and it's really important that they work together.
Nice, that's to the point, that's how I like it. Izzy?
I'm just going to pick up on 2 of the questions. The first one by the young woman in the yellow jumper about sort of the international issues, and I completely agree with you. I'm just as infuriated and saddened as you when I look at some of the stuff going on all over the world. But it comes back to the point that I made in my opening remarks. We face serious issues here in the UK. Some women in the UK can't access a free and legal and safe abortion. It's a serious issue. And again, what women are facing all over the world, why should a movement that deals with such trivial, vapid issues most of the time, why should the demand for change be left in their hands? Because I honestly don't think that they're capable of it. If they're saying we're too weak to deal with some of the most trivial things of day-to-day life, why should we leave it in their hands to go and demand why women in Africa should have access to contraceptions and things like that? I just don't think it's a good argument at all. And secondly, the question that was directed at me about prostitution, and it's a good question because I struggle with that sometimes myself. I wouldn't vocally encourage people to go out and be prostitutes, nor would I really, I have the conversation all the time with my male friends about porn. I don't get it. Why don't you just go and get the real thing? I don't understand this obsession with blokes watching porn. I think it's really unhelpful. But nonetheless, you have to demand, and you have to stick by the principle to allow women to do what they want to do, and it can be messy and it can be unhelpful. But our freedom to choose and do what we want is the most important thing. And it comes back to a point by one of my favourite feminists. I'm not even sure she would call herself a feminist anymore, but Camille Parlier. And I don't want to misquote her, but she said something along the lines of when American feminists in the 60s and 70s demanded the end to the locus parentis on campus, so they didn't have these sort of times that they had to be in at night. She said, we're demanding it because we want to risk the possibility of being raped. We want that freedom. Yes, it can be messy. Yes, the outcome can be horrendous, but we want to have the freedom to risk it. And I think it comes back to the same with prostitution and with porn. Life is messy. People make poor decisions, but they need to be free to make them.
Thanks, Jan.
Well, I'm not so sure on the international point. I mean, I think that there's a borrowing of authority, a borrowing of suffering, a borrowing of risks from third world or other areas of the world by Western feminists to increase their game and to amplify their claims that somehow things haven't changed enough. And I think they fail to make the distinction between what goes on there and why, and what goes on here and why. And I think it's very easy to create simplistic moral lines. We don't like FGM. We don't like child labour. We don't like women being denied this or that. And actually, each place is complex. I mean, it's a child's eye view of the world to think that somehow you can just from here say, that's bad, that's good, we want that to end, we want another Prime Minister here who's female. Well, who do you want? You're going to campaign for Marine Le Pen because she's a woman? I mean, it's ludicrous. Did you like Margaret Thatcher and therefore would like her return? Or where's your support for Theresa May? You know, it's those lines just do not work. They do not help us to explain the world. And, you know, really complicated issues like FGM and surrogacy, which I'll be discussing tomorrow in the Modern Family strand, you can't draw simple moral lines around these things. It just doesn't help, and it makes you look really stupid. And actually, if you were to speak to those people in those contexts, they would come up with some incredibly complicated arguments and rationales for why they do what they do. It is women doing these things. Not everything is imposed on women. Women are agents in many of these things that you don't like, from sitting in the comfort of your armchair over here. And so you have to try to understand them in their specific context. The man at the back who's trying to draw a kind of zero-sum game scenario here, where we have a reproduction of the Manichaean, women are good, men are bad, with the men are victims because now women are on top. It doesn't help to reverse things. You know, it's a silly way of looking at the world, especially now. At one point, it was not a bad description of the world when people genuinely were pretty segregated along gender lines. It is ludicrous to say that's the case. Now, women are quite happily sitting next to men, unless you want to go back to segregation or go to the segregation that you see in some other contexts with a curtain down the middle, then I suggest you work with the reality. So my example of where women really are oppressed today, I think, but not necessarily in a legal way, but certainly in a regulatory way, is something that feminists have been utterly silent about from the modern feminist, young feminist movement, which is the Breast is Best campaign. Breast is Best, internationalised, World Health Organization, UNICEF, every kind of local regional territory takes on this regulation, which means that women pay more for formula milk than they otherwise would. If the market were allowed to operate, women would pay substantially less for formula milk than they have to, because most people don't know this, but I spoke about it a few years ago at the Battle of Ideas. Formula milk companies are not allowed to apply, and supermarkets are not allowed to apply special offers to formula milk. You can't do it as part of a buy one, get one free deal. You can't have your club card loyalty points gained through buying formula milk. What did you ever say about that, Laura? What do the new feminists say about motherhood and the incredible imposition on women in quite subtle ways, but also very explicit ways, that breast is best?
I'll allow you to answer that, Laura.
Okay, so there's like 3 different things that I really wanted to answer quickly. So the first one about motherhood.
Yeah. Sorry, it's all about these guys, so we want to go back out, so pick one.
Okay, so basically, like, the whole motherhood thing is obviously a really complicated issue, and lots of feminists have always been speaking about it for a while, and so that's just a complicated issue. But feminists also argue the other side. But more importantly, I think that the idea that we have to have something like segregation in order to speak up and to campaign about the problems that we face is a ridiculous idea. The idea that young people should be quiet just because they aren't segregated in terms of their sexes is insane. And I think if young people feel like they face problems and they feel like they know how to solve those problems, they should be able to speak up and they should be respected for that. And very, very quickly, lastly, on the No More Page 3 thing that I forgot to talk about last time. So the No More Page 3 campaign didn't end an industry, by the way. Like, lots of women can still model if they want to. Similar articles are written all the time. However, it did try at least to change expectations of women and change the idea that women are only valued if they're sexualized. And the idea that women are only valued if they're sexualized does limit their choices further on down the line. It means they can't go into things like politics if they're considered only to be a sexual object, or if they're considered at first instance to be a sexual object. And it's fine if women are sexualized, and it's great if women own their sexualities, but they shouldn't be judged dependent on that.
Thank you very much. Okay, let's see some hands.
I'm Elizabeth from Justice for Men and Boys. Laura said that it's not a competition, the kind of gender politics, and Jan criticised Mike's, what he said as well. But it's quite clear to me that feminism, in particular, is about pushing for policies that disadvantage men and boys in order to benefit women and girls. If you look at quotas, if you look at their approaches to fathers' rights, to criminal justice and Me Too. But I also have a general question, which was for Sophie Walker. So maybe we can explore it. I think possibly Laura might be in favour of narrowing the gender pay gap and quotas for representation of women. And I would like to know, maybe some people in the audience too, why that people believe that equality of outcome is more desirable than equality of opportunities, choices and treatment.
Hi, I'm Hayley. I'm 15, and I just wanted to say that with the whole feminist thing, I feel like girls have the choice of what they want to wear, and like if you want to go out showing some of your skin, you should you should own it. Do you get what I mean? Like it's simple. Yeah, boys might criticize, boys might judge you, but some girls like that and some girls don't. I feel like you should just be you and live your best life. I really accept all your points about how I accept how you say that feminism is like in other countries. I understand that in other countries it's much worse for them because it's not under the same circumstances where that is in London. But I feel like sometimes feminism is blown out of proportion a lot. So they say like if you're walking on the street and there's someone like complimenting you, they say that's feminism. But if you think about it, you can't judge everything and point it at feminism. You need to just smile, wave back, and like, yeah, maybe you're ignoring it, but if you're happy with yourself and the way that you look, you should just be you.
Good point. That's what I like to see.
This is a question for Izzy, who said that women in this generation do not face as much inequality as women in the generation of our grandparents and parents. And I agree, but to some extent, because men who have lived through those generations have chosen to implement those patriarchal ideas into this generation. So how can we say that women don't face as much inequality as they did before?
Hiya. You've talked about Me Too and Time's Up. Do you think the association of feminism with stars and stardom has elevated the debate, or do you think it's actually turned feminism into a sort of self-promotional commodity for the stars themselves?
This is just a short question. Would you say modern-day feminism is a form of marketing?
Ooh, good question. Glittery feminist bags and H&M. Right.
This is a question to Izzy. You mentioned earlier that feminism in a global sense shouldn't be in the hands of just the young white women in England, that they shouldn't be the ones entrusted with implementing global feminism. Then why aren't the silent majority you spoke about doing something? Why isn't there a wider voice being spoken up that aren't these modern feminists that we're speaking about that are going and doing something about the injustice and inequality for women in the global scheme?
Very good. Izzy, let's start with you on that.
That's a good question, and I don't know, to be honest with you. I don't really have an answer for it. My main issue with the point that's made that because women still face injustices all over the world, that we therefore can't criticise Western feminism. And that's what this is largely about. This isn't just young white women in the UK. This is women in Australia, America, North America. So the idea that, we can't criticise that purely because there are still inequalities all over the world, I think is wrong. And I think we should be completely free to do that. Why people aren't up in arms about it, I don't know. Your guess is probably just as good as mine. Coming onto that lady over there, you fill me with so much hope. I love it. You're young, you're confident, and you know it's so refreshing to see that everything that we read about in the newspapers, and I'm a journalist, I work in newspapers, is that young women that we're victims, that we're scared, that we, 60%, 70% of us have experienced catcalls and etc. like that, and we feel like we've been oppressed. And then to see people like you, it's very refreshing, it's very encouraging. So thank you for putting your hand up.
All right, thanks. Jan, let's hear what you have to say.
Yeah, I agree, and I think it is quite refreshing to see people prepared to embrace heterosexuality, because it's become the kind of drive of the last 20 years or so has been to completely denormalise heterosexuality. Heteronormativity is a very bad thing, apparently, and what's got scooped up in that attempt, originally possibly to sort of diversify things and to actually give us greater freedom in how we might live, has become an attack on heterosexuality itself and on masculinity in particular, and particular versions of femininity. And I think all of those things are attacks on particular ways of being, which end up narrowing the ways of being that we're supposed to, that are acceptable. So I think it's really nice when people embrace heterosexuality. I'm all for that. I think there's a very interesting point that was made about the passing down of ideas. And I think immigration raises some particular issues here, actually, which, again, people are very reluctant to say very often, which I think is very particular experiences. People like me, our grandparents would have been British or Irish origin grandparents, Welsh. They would have had sort of certain norms in place that would have been very gendered norms of what they expected. But they did move. They really moved really quite fast, and things that would have been held quite firmly as demands for respectable behaviour for my mother's generation were just loosened by the time I came along, and my grandmother was able to actually enjoy that. And so she remembered scolding my mother for wearing a skirt that was too short in the 1960s, but at the same time thought it was hilarious that I didn't iron my husband's shirts. And she sort of feigned shock, but at the same time I could tell she really liked the idea that that was now possible and nobody was going to call me a bad wife because of that. So I think that once you really talk to people, even the people apart from perhaps the most kind of fundamentally attached to the old ways, most people are dealing with really complex ways of moving from the old to the new. But I think the thing we have to decide is which bits of the new we actually want to go with, and which are the things that we decide are actually moving us backwards rather than forwards, if that's not too messy.
Okay. Izzy, just wanted to make another point.
Just it was the question that the young lady asked, and I think that's what Jan was talking about. There is a distinct difference between the sexism my mother and grandmother faced and what supposed sexism I face today. There is a massive, massive difference. We can't not get a job today because if we were turned down for an employment opportunity because of my gender, that is against the law. We cannot legally be paid less than a man. That is against the law. We can access contraception. We can access abortion. We can access domestic abuse services. When my grandma, back in the 60s, rang domestic abuse hotlines, the police would come along and then leave and do nothing about it. If that happened today, that would be a scandal. So we are far, far more fortunate than our grandmothers and mothers. And I think suggesting that we aren't, again, feeds back into this victim narrative.
Okay, thank you. Laura?
So really quick rebuttal just from that last point. It's not really about being victims, and it's not about necessarily comparing the rights that we have today in comparison to those of our grandparents. It's more about just dealing with the issues that we still face today. And those issues that we face today are no less damaging and no less important just because we may have faced greater problems in the past. And those problems in the past, they really feed into the problems that we face today. So I think connecting the two rather than comparing the two is important to overcoming them. Also, I wanted to talk really quickly about quotas. And I think it's important just to think that quotas aren't about taking away from men. It's more about equalising gender balances, especially in areas like banking, for example, where men can earn up to 70% more than women, basically just because they're men and they're in positions that women haven't traditionally been in, and therefore they may find it more difficult to get into those spheres. So it's about equalising the opportunities that men and women face, having a more diverse workforce, getting better results out of a workforce that's more diverse. And also, going back to the first question, I remembered I forgot to talk about mental health issues, and that obviously is a really, really important, really serious issue that men specifically face probably more than women do. And feminism is about tackling the problems that men face from sexism and the problems that they have to deal with from ideas of masculinity as well as the hypersexualization of women. So it goes two ways, and lots of men are behind the feminist movement, and so, you know, feminists do appreciate that as well. The idea of feminism as marketing, I thought was a really interesting idea. And I think that it's interesting because it shows that the way that like feminism is expanding, and that will be exciting to see what that brings to feminism, whether that brings like more opinions, whether it makes women more confident about talking about things, whether it makes men more confident about talking about feminist issues as well. Also, I wanted to talk about the idea of passing down ideas, which I thought was really interesting. And that's kind of a reason why I think personally anyway, we should keep the name feminism, because it has such an important history and such an important legacy of developing ideas and passing down ideas that has resulted in us being in the stage that we are today. So it's really important to keep that up. And then also really quickly, very last one, the idea, why aren't people talking from different perspectives? Why aren't lots of people talking about feminism and the problems they face from different backgrounds? I think to overcome that, we need to really nurture young voices rather than attack them. And we need to amplify the problems that they face and the ways that they feel that they can solve their problems, which is probably different to the ways that we solve problems at the moment. And we should just, encourage young people to speak up, basically.
I'm just curious because there was this other ism once upon a time which was called universalism. And a lot of the things that Laura has described as feminism, it's about men, it's about women, it's about marginalized groups. That used to be universalism. And I'm just curious why you think it is that this is under the label, why people want to put it under the label of feminism. And also, I mean, personally, I feel like there's a sort of an element of bad faith in that, maybe you can't really have universalism because there's something about men that would prevent that. But I was wondering if you could talk about that.
Thank you.
So thank you very much for the interesting talk. So I just wanted to elaborate a few ideas about feminism. I think the thing is that there are sort of two sides to feminism. I think that when feminism says that men and women have equal opportunity, with the key word being on opportunity, to do whatever they like in their life, in their career, children, whatever it is, if women want to be grid girls or they want to be scientists, and it's based in a kind of Western liberalism, and I've never had a problem with that in any way, shape or form. I think it's very important that people have the opportunity to do what they want in life. But when feminism says things like all disparities in outcome are due to automatic discrimination, and that masculinity is toxic, which it isn't, and that gender is entirely a social construct, which it isn't, and that domestic violence is almost entirely men beating up on women, which it isn't, and that the suffragettes were these wonderful women that should be deserved to be romanticised, which they're not, as far as I'm concerned. And so just a litany of endless examples of terrible, and men and women are to blame for the patriarchy, which is just like a ridiculous conspiracy theory as far as I'm concerned. My concern is for the feminism that has been propagated in academia, and it seems to be now intertwined with postmodernism and all of these kinds of things. And it seems to have been, I've seen the footage on YouTube, it's been radicalising young students into social justice warriors and so on. That's my concern. I can never be a feminist under current conditions. I'm sorry.
You've talked about calling feminism, what the word means. And as a 17-year-old, I was shocked that 2 weeks ago, one of my best friends who I've known since I was 5 turned around and told me that she only just realised that feminism was about gender equality, because the word comes from the Latin femina, meaning woman, and it's very, very misleading. So do you think the way forward, Laura, you mentioned kind of you need to keep that legacy, but a lot of, especially boys my age as well, they're very reluctant to call themselves feminists because they don't know what it means and they feel like they're being emasculated and it's not cool. And so is the way forward like wiping the slate clean and creating a new word? I've heard people talking about equalism, and so completely making a new movement which is all very, very based around purely gender equality, and it's not being manipulated by these other views and opinions which are kind of being dragged through with feminism at the moment.
Thank you. Next to you.
I just picked up on the fact that a lot of the time people are referring to young people as, well, young people who identify as feminists as kind of this young feminist as a type almost. And I have a lot of friends who would identify as feminists, and I have a lot of friends who wouldn't. And I'm just kind of wondering, what do you mean when you say young feminist? Because personally, I agree with some of your ideas, and I disagree with some of the others. And I know that, I think Laura, sorry if that's wrong, said that she was about amplifying young people's voices, and I'm just wondering, are you about amplifying young people's voices as a general, or are you about amplifying every young person's voice? Or are you only about amplifying young people's voices as long as they match your own?
My question is for Jan. You mentioned the sex war. Are you for it or against it? Do you want to get rid of it, or do you want to celebrate it?
I was just wondering, because I was thinking about the suffragette movement, and I personally have my doubts about it, because what they achieved, I think, can't be argued with at all. It was fantastic. But I think the method they went about achieving it over the years has become sort of glorified in the way it doesn't really deserve. Like, I talk with some of my friends who aren't here today, and we sometimes make the link in our infinite wisdom between them and sort of perhaps terrorist methods, perhaps you might see similar to the IRA and such. So should we still celebrate these people as much as we do?
Hi, my question's actually about whether you think feminism is overexpanded. Because as we've been talking, you've brought up things like child labour, people in other countries, heterosexuality, which doesn't actually just apply to women. So would you say that the fact that feminism is starting to dabble its hand in so many different topics, do you think this subtracts from the fact that we're actually trying to get equal rights for both men and women? Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm 17, I'm Jewish and I'm a student, and I can't remember which one mentioned the fact that there's a lot more isms nowadays than we could rather like to boil everything down to feminism. My question is it now wrong for me to be a white millennial feminist? Because I don't live in a third world country and I don't understand the feminist issues in that country as much as I try to advocate political issues in other countries, and I do a lot of work there. But is it wrong for me to be young, white, and class myself as a feminist?
I think you're getting a bit of an easy ride. It's unfortunate that your other speaker isn't here and might be standing up for the feminist cause and debate. One way I would look at this is that the idea of feminism, I think probably everybody here would probably think it's kind of, at worst, it's harmless, yeah? And then it's good, or it's positive, or in its own kind of way, it's constructive and it's doing something good. That's wrong. I think there should be an argument put forward that feminism, and I think a couple of the people on the panel have put this forward, that thinking about the world through a gender viewpoint is a really negative, divisive, worrying, problematic thing, let's say, to go forward. And the analogy I would use is race. I think everybody here, and there are some sessions over the weekend, but broadly people think that thinking about the world through a race narrative, right, is very problematic, right? Most people would say that was a wrong thing. Certainly if I was referring to race as it was understood before the Second World War, yeah? And since after the Second World War, racial thinking about the world through terms of race, became basically discredited. However, thinking about the world on gender lines has not yet been discredited, and I kind of secretly hope that this kind of wave of privileged feminism, you mentioned 70% of bankers, is that really the sort of problem that we should be worrying about, might actually collapse quicker than we actually think.
Thank you. I'm going to come back to the panel. I'm coming back out, so hold your horses. Laura, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, so why don't I start with that last question, just so it's fresh in our minds. I basically think that looking through for a whole group of people anyway, to look at the world through a gendered perspective is a good thing. And I think that it's equally good for people to also look at the world through a race perspective as well, just because that helps us to highlight issues that perhaps are considered normalities and we wouldn't otherwise highlight. So it is important to think about how many people of different ethnicities are in CEO positions. Because if we find that there aren't many, and by the way, there aren't many, then that's probably a problem, and that's probably a problem that we need to solve in some way. And we need to look at why that is. And if we don't look at the whole picture first, we'll never really tackle those problems that people face. Also, so I wanted to talk about the idea of universalism versus feminism. And I think that kind of they are interrelated, but feminism, has always been about not just women, but different subsections of women. So take, for example, in the 1800s, little known feminists and eventually suffragettes, like Louise Creighton. She worked to educate girls, but specifically girls from low socioeconomic backgrounds. And so it's always been a part of feminism, not just to look at women and not just to look at the problems that women as a whole group face, but the whole variety of problems that a whole variety of women face. And that's again about looking at things through a different perspectives to really effectively solve the problems that lots of different women face. So, very briefly, I was going to talk about. Okay, so also, the idea that feminism is perhaps too expansive, I think that's an interesting question to think about. But for me, I think that if feminism expands more, that's probably a good thing, just because there's no issue too big or too small to tackle effectively. Sexism, for example, isn't one big thing. It's a whole load of different examples of sexism that constitutes the whole issue. So, for example, I'll end on this very last analogy. So some people say to me, for example, working on the tampon tax campaign, why do you bother working on something so small? It's not really going to affect many people. But then I like to say back to people, well, we're working on cures for things like cancer, so would you suggest that we just work on curing death? Probably not. Equally, you have to work on the smaller symptoms of sexism in order to cure the thing as a whole. So.
Thank you. Okay, Izzy.
I'm going to come back to the point that the young gentleman made about the suffragettes. I completely disagree. I think they're bloody legends and they should absolutely be celebrated. What they achieved, I think we can all unanimously agree, was right and amazing. The means by which they did it, you can debate that as long as you want, but I don't think they were going to get the vote by sitting around a table. So, first point. Second point, I think it was someone over here mentioned about should we change the word feminism, use a different word, because you mentioned that a lot of your male young friends are reluctant to sign up to it. I don't think you're going to solve the issues that are deeply ingrained with feminism by changing the title. I think, like you said, a lot of young people, well, it's not just young people, the percentage I read out at the beginning, most people in this country do not consider themselves a feminist. And that's not because of the title. I think it's a tarnished word, yes, I think it's a tarnished movement, but it's because of the fundamental issues with it that we've been discussing over the past hour. So no, I don't think that would do anything. I think that would be a surface sort of issue that is far more ingrained. There's far more deep-rooted issues.
Thanks, Jan.
Yeah, well, on the question of the word, which word do we use? I think you suggested, that boys are reluctant to call themselves feminists because they don't know what it means. And I think they are reluctant to call themselves feminists because they know exactly what it means. And it doesn't mean them. And it does mean that they're a problem and that they will be endlessly talked of as being perpetrators or potential perpetrators or ignorant to the sufferings of women. And I just think it's so insulting and divisive. So I think we need a word for whatever it is going to motivate us to go out into the world and solve whichever problems we think need solving. And I think a gender prism really, really doesn't help us with that. There is a word for this. It's called humanism. And humanism has been many things in lots of ways, and I'm sure if you mind it, you can find your problems. However, I think it can be counterposed to this really grim worldview that's currently on offer, and it's the one that is being marketed to young people. How many people have had Laura Bates visit their school? Oh, none. Great. Okay. That disproves my point. Oh, you have. I know you have. And I know that boys were excluded from the meeting. Anyway, so I think the thing about humanism is that it's the opposite of problem-mongering. It's about actually trying to, initially supposes that human beings are the solution. We cause our problems, but we also are the solution to our problems, and it's people, not men or women. And it's essentially an optimistic outlook, and I think that luckily in this room we have people who are pretty hungry for a more optimistic outlook, and I'm really hopeful that that's where we can start to move. But to do that, you will have to pick a fight with feminism, I'm afraid.
Okay.
I guess that it makes it sound like feminism is going to be this great group of people who only agree, and I think that's naive at best. And the idea that we can go back and be Countess Markovich or anyone else, we don't have the same challenges. The challenges that we have evolve and change. Even if you're all members of, I don't know, the Labour Party or the Tory Party, you're not all going to agree. The whole thing about feminism is that we have a debate about the changes that we want to see, and different feminisms will drive different ideas forward. I hate the idea of excluding men from that dialogue, because we have to support each other rather than look for ways for one of us to be better than the other. So I guess my point is not a question, but more a comment. And the idea that it wouldn't be messy, as so many things in life are, I think is fairly uninteresting. And I don't think the problem is the word feminism. It's more that we divide ourselves in lines, and we think that feminism's a bigger problem than, I don't know, the Tory Party, whatever.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Fatima and I'm 15 years old. I think that it's important to focus on the positive achievements that we've made throughout the years rather than constantly focus on the negative, because if we constantly focus on the negative things, then we won't be able to achieve more things and get closer to equality. So yeah.
Hey, this is a question for Laura. Basically, earlier you were talking about how feminism is very diverse and there's a lot of problems with it. Like, there's loads of problems that need to be addressed. And whilst I am for gender equality, I just want to know how, in the legality of things, how you expect to push certain changes in the law when you're trying to address loads of different things at once.
Hi, question to Laura. There's so many feminist categories. Which one do you assign yourself to mostly, and why?
I guess when I read online, a lot of the stuff I read, it feels as if celebrities now have to call themselves feminists just to be able to have a career, and it's just kind of boring, because it feels as if they don't really mean it, and it feels as if feminism used to be about rejecting society's opinions of women, whereas now it's you have to be a feminist to be part of society. So it just feels a bit, calling yourself a feminist now is a bit pointless.
We've talked about it a little bit, but the move towards feminism is the promotion of female victimhood. And somebody said that, at the best, it's sort of a nice to have, and hopefully there's some positive byproducts. I don't think we've explored enough the really negative byproducts. And I don't mean for men, I mean actually for women themselves. Because I think the growth of this victim narrative is actually starting to set women back. And that's my concern of witnessing so many women now assuming that anything negative that happens to them in their lives is because of the patriarchy and because of discrimination. And that actually is not doing those women any favours at all, because what they're doing is giving themselves a get-out clause for things that they could be doing better. And we're also exacerbating the tendency that I think many women have towards imposter syndrome and a confidence gap, which we witness time and time again and is borne out in surveys and how women put themselves forward for jobs and negotiate for pay. And I feel that feminism is only undermining that further. We're telling women they're going to be discriminated against, and that's going to be a self-fulfilling prophecy that will actually harm them and not increase their opportunities.
Just for Izzy, you said that feminism can cause victims in women and it will make them more victims, but I would challenge that, because feminism, for me especially, would make me less of a victim. It would, all the things that I would be victim of would be victims of without feminism, and feminism makes me more able to do that. Like, without it, I wouldn't be much less confident to speak out about it, and it's more about speaking out about it than causing it and making it more of an issue.
Hi, I'd like to stay seated if that's all right.
Oh, okay, fine.
So I have a question on the victimhood thing for Izzy. So yesterday I was piloting a consent workshop with quite a large group of university students, first years. And we were going through like myths of sexual assault, and one of them was women provoke sexual violence by the way that they're dressed. And being in a bubble, I thought that everyone would say, you know, that's ridiculous, that has really awful implications for women. And quite a few of the male students in the room said that they completely agree, and that they think that women should expect sexual assault if they go out in certain clothes. And I just wanted to say on that, and although that shocked me, it turned into quite a good debate in the end. But I refuse to apologise for being scared that this person is a representation of millions and millions of men throughout the world, and I don't feel any less of a woman. I don't feel weak, and I still feel empowered throughout many kind of things in my life. But I think that I kind of agree with the lady over there that these views are going to exist regardless, and I'm not going to apologise for being scared when I go out at night. I still feel extremely empowered in other ways through my gender and through my sexuality, but I think that we can't ignore the importance of feminism because women are more likely to be victims of sexual assault.
Do you believe that men do not want to associate themselves with a feminist movement because of the name, or because of a term that a lot of females are using these days who claim to be feminists, that they claim that men are trash?
I'm just going to say I'm really nervous about speaking. As you can tell, I'm tearing up. And this isn't really political, it's more social. Do you believe that women, when in a social group, they're kind of seen as less funny, less intelligent, and all these things compared to men? Because I've been in bands, for example, and I'm a guitarist, and I don't want to sound vain when I say this, but I would consider myself good. And
it's not vain. Fair play.
Yeah.
Sure you are. Yeah.
And there's been a few times where I've been rejected from bands, and the guitarist that they've chose, he's not as good as me. I'm not going to lie. And I've got friends that have done diplomas in electric guitar, and they've been rejected, and the people who've been chosen to be in this band can't even play. I'm not going to lie, they're bad.
Okay.
So what are your views on that?
Thank you. Right.
Hi, this is for Izzy, and I think it's very interesting what you were saying about smaller sexist acts such as catcalling being put on this same platform, but I'd actually argue that small sexist acts like catcalling, they are definitely not on the same level as rape and female genital mutilation, and I don't think that's what feminism is about. However, those small sexist acts contribute to an overall culture of attitudes to women that certain men, and at all, not all men, will then use to elevate acts of, more serious offences. For example, I have a friend who's incredibly beautiful, and when I've been out with her, she's been catcalled about 10 times. She has also been raped. There is a correlation between those two. If we look at other isms, such as racism, nobody says that cultural appropriation, such as white celebrities wearing cornrows, is on the same level as black men and women being shot by police in America. However, it contributes to a culture of white privilege.
I wanted to talk about the issue that was raised a bit earlier about the freedom of choice and how feminism, like the issues about the page 3 being removed, actually accentuates sexism because it's removing the freedom of choice for many women. But I think it's dangerous to say that kind of thing because it's ignoring the factor that there are actually other influences behind the decisions and the choices that people make. And it doesn't make sense to forget the fact that we do live in a society in which certain ideas and attitudes about women affect the choices that they make. So I just wanted to ask what you think about that.
Thank you very much. Right, we've got 5 minutes left. That means you're each going to have about a minute and a half. This is just summing up and take in anything that you want, that you've heard, but also make any final points. I think we'll start with you, Laura.
So quickly, how do you change the law in lots of different ways? I think it's through lots of small campaigns and lots of people campaigning on different issues, which means like loads of you in the room. So many people have asked really, really great questions and like loads of really, it makes me really excited to hear all your questions. So definitely start campaigns and anything you want to. What kind of feminism do I assign to? Well, I love Simone de Beauvoir. She's my favourite person ever. But I think more generally, I'm an intersectional feminist, because feminism is about not just making sure you speak up yourself and you have the confidence to speak up and make changes, but it's also about amplifying the voices of other people around you that don't necessarily have the same platforms as you have yourself. I was going to talk about rebutting the idea that feminism creates victimhood, but actually, like, so many people asking questions have already done that. So thank you so much. I don't have to do that now. Also, just want to say, obviously, men aren't trash, and I really like men, and lots of feminists do as well. And the guitar problem. By the way, you're great at speaking, so definitely shouldn't be nervous. But the guitar problem, I think, just shows wider problems in societies. Like, lots of women are great at things, but they're not necessarily taken seriously because they're women. So keep playing your guitar and you'll be great. But the final thing that I want to talk about was basically that we can be optimistic and we can make changes without picking a fight with feminism. And I think just go ahead, and there's a lovely woman called Fatima in the audience who was basically saying that we should focus on the positives, and I think that's so important. Just go out, whatever problems you see, try to solve them, and you'll be great. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sarah.
To the young lady at the back in the long blonde hair, the idea that catcalling is on a continuum with rape is one of the most dangerous ideas that contemporary feminism has pushed out recently. A guy who catcalls me in the street is gross, and more often than not, I do sling my middle finger up. The idea he can then go and rape me, really, really dangerous. And you want to talk about pushing men away from the feminism movement, then you're right on the money with that. Second point, the young girl who said she is afraid to go out at night and she's not willing to apologise for that. I sort of commend your bravery. The idea that you were at a consent workshop, I think, says a lot about, again, what contemporary feminism is doing to young women. It's making us afraid to have interactions with blokes. Again, the same with guys. The fact that consent workshops exist, I find quite terrifying, luckily, before my time at university. And lastly, someone mentioned that at worst, feminism is harmless. I think that's really wrong, because I think feminism is incredibly harmless what it's doing. It's impacting policy. It's impacting social interaction in a really, really, really negative way. It's telling young women that they should be afraid to go out at night on university campus because a guy's going to jump out from a bush and rape them. Like, it's really, really, really wrong. And just to finish on an anecdote, I think, which sums up perfectly what's happened. My aunt was in work recently and she had her hair drastically changed, and this is sort of after Me Too, and one of her colleagues turned around and said, "Oh, I really like your new haircut." Halfway through, he stopped speaking and was like, I'm so sorry, I can't say things like that anymore. And to think that a guy can't compliment his female colleague because she's got a new haircut, like, that is scary, and that is precisely why I think feminism needs to end.
Thank you. Jan.
I think we need to ask what solutions are being posed here, and I think what's being demanded is a sanitising of public and private space. And I think that a world that's worth living in and a world that's free, you have to reject the sanitising of your life, because your life has to be something that is genuinely free for you to operate in, and one in which you make your own judgments. And that includes deciding what is a reasonable thing to wear when you walk out at night. I presume you don't walk around in a bikini at 1 o'clock in the morning. In the same way, when I used to have to cycle to work at 7 o'clock in the morning, I used to wear a woolly hat so that I didn't get any unwanted attention. So, as it happens, catcalling is something, believe me, you will grow out of as a problem. Unless you run, as I do, with somebody much younger, in which case you can get a few and share them out between you. And, you know, as Izzy said, your response is either that or you kind of laugh and go, well, I've still got it. You know, it's fine. I mean, it really, they are words. And I think the words and action distinction is absolutely crucial. And it's one that feminism has done a great deal to elide. And we need to restate that difference because that's what makes us free. We're free if we can accept that the words around us and the words we hear, we can deal with. And now actually we have laws in place to deal with actual acts and behaviour, and we might argue that some of those need to be enforced better or whatever, but we have to retain this distinction where a free space can happen because we can interact between ourselves in ways that are just free. We're not running scared, we're not worried that we're going to be traumatised, we're not worried that we're going to traumatise somebody else. We have to kind of embrace this possibility that actually was opened up by the shift in gender relations in the 20th century, which is for men and women to really be relatively indivisible from one another in very many meaningful ways.
Thank you, Jan.